The morning they dragged Joanne Rusk to the center of the Silver Moon Pack's gathering ground and threw her trunk into the mud, not one wolf in the circle stepped forward. Not one. The chest hit the frozen earth with a sound like something breaking that was never meant to break. Her mother's shawl, the gray wool one she had mended along the hem 4 separate times, each stitch smaller and more careful than the last, because it was the only thing her mother had left her, unraveled from the latch and landed in the dirt like a flag of surrender she had never agreed to raise. She did not reach for it. Not yet. She had learned in the 7 years since her mother passed and left her to the mercy of the Silver Moon Pack that moving too quickly was how they decided you were afraid. And Joanne Rusk had given Alpha Silas very few things over the years, but she had never once given him her fear. She was not about to begin today. Alpha Silas stood at the head of the circle with his thick arms folded across his chest and his scarred jaw set in the expression he wore when he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, the one he claimed he had earned in battle, the one the older wolves muttered he had received from a door handle during a drunken evening, pulled tighter when he smiled. He was smiling now. Behind him, the pack gathered in their rows, some in their wolf forms, great dark furred bodies seated on their haunches with their amber eyes catching the gray winter light. Most remained human, wrapped in their furs and their judgment, watching the way people watch when they are glad the thing happening is not happening to them. Joanne recognized every face. She had cooked for those faces. She had carried firewood to their doorsteps and patched their children's clothing, and stood at the back of every communal meal, because the Omega did not sit at the table. The Omega waited until the others had finished, and then ate what remained, if anything remained, which was not always. She had not complained, not once. It had not saved her. "Joanne Rusk," Silas said, and his voice rolled out across the frozen ground with the practiced weight of a man who had announced verdicts before and enjoyed the sound of his own authority. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, the one he claimed he had earned in battle, the one the older wolves muttered he had received from a door handle during a drunken evening, pulled tighter when he smiled. He was smiling now. Behind him, the pack gathered in their rows, some in their wolf forms, great dark furred bodies seated on their haunches with their amber eyes catching the gray winter light. Most remained human, wrapped in their furs and their judgment, watching the way people watch when they are glad the thing happening is not happening to them. Joanne recognized every face. She had cooked for those faces. She had carried firewood to their doorsteps and patched their children's clothing, and stood at the back of every communal meal, because the Omega did not sit at the table. The Omega waited until the others had finished, and then ate what remained, if anything remained, which was not always. She had never complained, not once. It had not saved her. "Joanne Rusk," Silas said, and his voice rolled out across the frozen ground with the practiced weight of a man who had announced verdicts before and enjoyed the sound of his own authority. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, the one he claimed he had earned in battle, the one the older wolves muttered he had received from a door handle during a drunken evening, pulled tighter when he smiled. He was smiling now. Behind him, the pack gathered in their rows, some in their wolf forms, great dark furred bodies seated on their haunches with their amber eyes catching the gray winter light. Most remained human, wrapped in their furs and their judgment, watching the way people watch when they are glad the thing happening is not happening to them. Joanne recognized every face. She had cooked for those faces. She had carried firewood to their doorsteps and patched their children's clothing, and stood at the back of every communal meal, because the Omega did not sit at the table. The Omega waited until the others had finished, and then ate what remained, if anything remained, which was not always. She had never complained, not once. It had not saved her. "Joanne Rusk," Silas said, and his voice rolled out across the frozen ground with the practiced weight of a man who had announced verdicts before and enjoyed the sound of his own authority. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, the one he claimed he had earned in battle, the one the older wolves muttered he had received from a door handle during a drunken evening, pulled tighter when he smiled. He was smiling now. "The Silver Moon Pack does not shelter dead weight," Silas said. He reached down and picked up her mother's shawl from the mud with 2 fingers, the way you pick up something you find repellent. He held it for a moment. Then he dropped it again. "You are exiled from this territory. You will take your things and you will leave before the sun reaches midday, and if you are found within our borders after that, you will be treated as a trespasser." He turned his back on her. The circle shifted. Some wolves had already begun to disperse. The verdict had been given, the ceremony was over, and Joanne Rusk was already becoming a story they would tell differently depending on who was listening. She crouched down in the mud and picked up her mother's shawl. She did not wring it out. She folded it, carefully, along the original creases and tucked it into what remained of her trunk. She gathered her 2 spare chemises, the small tin cup, the book of old notation her mother had pressed into her hands the week before she died, the one written in a script so ancient Joanne had spent 3 years teaching herself to read even a portion of it because her mother had said, keep this close. One day you will need to know what it says." She latched the trunk. The hinge was bent now, so it did not close properly, but she pressed it together with her thumb until it held. Then she stood. Her back straightened the way it always did when she was most afraid and most determined to ensure that no one could tell the two apart. Her chin leveled. She looked at the space where Silas had been standing, and then at the ring of faces still watching her, curious now, or uneasy, or both, and she picked up her trunk by its broken handle. She walked across the frozen ground and through the pack gates and down the long dirt road that led away from Silver Moon territory, and she did not look back. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned in the long and particular school of being unwanted that looking back was how they won. The wilderness opened around her, cold, vast, indifferent. She walked into it. She had 3 copper coins, half a loaf of hard bread, and a name that no one in this world seemed to think was worth anything. She also had, somewhere in the spine of her mother's old book, a set of runes she had spent 3 years learning to read. She did not yet know that those 2 facts were the same fact. She did not yet know that the symbol on her left shoulder, the faint crescent mark she had been born with, the one her mother had always covered with thick woven cloth and told her to keep hidden, the one she had mostly stopped thinking about, had been glowing, faintly, for the last 4 minutes. She did not yet know what was waiting for her at the end of this road, but she walked toward it anyway, because that was the only direction left. If you've ever been told you were nothing, and knew, somewhere deep and unshakable, that they were wrong, this story is for you. This pack sees you. Every single one of you who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or cast out. You belong here. Drop a wolf in the comments if you felt Joanne's walk in your chest. Like this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear that being suppressed is not the same as being powerless, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried. The vault is just ahead, and what's inside it will change everything. Stay with us. The road to Dark Peak took 3 days on foot. Joanne had not expected it to be easy. She had not, if she was being precise about it, expected to survive it at all. Not in the way that people mean when they speak dramatically about hardship, but in the plain, practical sense of a woman alone in winter with a broken trunk and 3 copper coins and no certainty of what waited at the other end. The wilderness between Silver Moon territory and the Citadel did not care about her story. The cold did not make exceptions for quiet dignity. The first night she slept in the hollow of a fallen oak with her mother's shawl pulled over her face and her knees drawn to her chest, and she lay awake listening to the wind move through the bare trees, and she thought, with a clarity that only real cold produces, I will not die here. Not like this. Not before I understand what happened to me. It was not hope, exactly. It was something harder than hope, something more like refusal. By the second morning, the trees had thinned and the road had widened, and she could see in the far distance the dark shape of the mountains they called the Dark Peak. Not a single summit, but a range of them, crowded together like old men in council, their upper edges lost in cloud. The Citadel sat at the base of the largest, built into the rock itself, in the way that very old and very serious architecture tends to be, as though whoever commissioned it had wanted to make clear that this structure did not merely occupy the land, but had grown from it, was part of it, could not be separated from it without consequence. She arrived at the outer gates on the evening of the third day with mud on her boots and her trunk handle wrapped in a strip torn from her second chemise because the original had finally given way somewhere on the mountain road. The guards looked at her the way guards look at things that arrive uninvited and on foot. "Work posting," she said, before either of them could speak. "I saw it at the crossroads board, someone to organize the ancestral archives. I can read, I can write. I know old notation." The guards exchanged a look. One of them, younger with a fresh scar across his chin that had not yet decided whether it would fade, seemed unsure. The other, older with the particular stillness of someone who has spent many years watching the wrong people be turned away, looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Third corridor, down 2 flights. Wait outside the study door." She waited outside the study door for 40 minutes. She used the time to straighten her chemise and retuck her mother's shawl and remind herself that she had walked 3 days through winter wilderness and she was still standing, which meant that whatever was on the other side of that door was unlikely to be worse than what was behind her. Then the door opened and she revised that assessment slightly. Alpha King Edward Garcia was not what she had expected, which was itself a problem, because she had not expected to have expectations. She had constructed in the abstract an image of a man built for intimidation, broad, loud, occupying space the way powerful men often did, as though the room owed it its dimensions. What she found instead was someone who seemed almost deliberately contained. He was tall, yes, and the dark velvet coat with its gold trim along the collar and cuffs made him look precisely as significant as his title required. But it was his face that arrested her. Sharp, careful, the kind of face that had learned a long time ago that expression was information and had decided to give very little of it away. His eyes moved to her immediately and stayed there, which was either a good sign or a bad one, and she was not yet in a position to determine which. He stood at his desk with one hand resting on the surface beside an open scroll. Behind him, the wall held 3 shelves of documents in varying states of disarray, some rolled, some folded, some simply stacked in the particular chaos of papers that have been consulted urgently and repeatedly and never properly replaced. She noticed that the chaos was not random. There was a pattern to it, a logic she could almost read, like a sentence written in a language she knew imperfectly. Someone had been searching for something specific and had not found it. "You can read old notation," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "How old?" She told him. She named the script forms she knew, the ones her mother had taught her from the book, the ones she had worked out from context and repetition over 3 years of evenings with a candle stub and no company. She watched his face as she spoke, and it did not change, but something behind it did, a very slight recalibration, the way a set of scales adjusts when the weight placed on them is different from what was anticipated. "The ancestral archives have not been properly organized in 60 years. The previous archivist retired, the one before that disappeared, the one before that," he paused, "I have been told had an accident. I have reason to believe that history may be a more complicated word than it is typically treated as." Joanne looked at him. "You think someone removed things from the archive?" A pause. "I think someone arranged things in the archive in a manner that served a particular version of events. I would like to know what a different arrangement reveals." "And you are telling me this before you have hired me." "I am telling you this so that you understand what you would be walking into. I find informed employees make better decisions." She thought about the crossroads board. She thought about the 3 copper coins in her pocket and the broken trunk handle and the fact that she had nowhere else to go. And she also thought, and this was the part she would not have admitted aloud, not then, that the word arrangement had snagged on something in her mind and would not let go, because her mother had arranged things too. Her mother had kept her mark covered, her journals close, her father's name obscured, and her reasons entirely to herself. And Joanne had spent 7 years wondering what shape the truth underneath all that arrangement might actually take. "When do I start?" she said. He told her she would be given a room in the East Corridor, a servant's wage, and access to the archive beginning the following morning. He said it with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to transactions, and she accepted with the same, and she picked up her trunk and followed the young guard with the healing scar to a room that was small and cold and entirely hers, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held her mother's shawl in both hands and allowed herself, for the exact duration of one slow breath, to feel something that was almost relief. Then she folded the shawl, set it on the pillow, and began to think about what she might find in the morning. The corridor that led from the east wing to the forbidden vault ran beneath the oldest part of the Citadel, where the stone walls were thick enough to muffle sound entirely, and the torches sat in iron brackets so ancient the rust had become structural. Joanne walked it for the first time the next morning with the young guard. She had learned his name was Cale, 2 steps ahead of her, and a ring of iron keys at his belt that chimed softly with each step, like a very small, very somber bell. She was halfway down the corridor when she stopped. The painting hung on the wall between 2 torches in a frame that had once been gilded and was now merely gold adjacent, the leaf worn down to suggestion in the corners. It was large, nearly floor to ceiling, and depicted a woman standing in a garden that Joanne did not recognize, against a sky that was either dawn or dusk, the light coming from below the horizon in long gold ribbons that caught on the fabric of the woman's dress and made it look as though she herself were the source of the illumination. The dress was deep gold, not yellow, not amber, the specific, saturated, ancient gold of something that has been given weight by time. Joanne stood very still. The woman in the painting had dark hair pulled back from her face, and her face, the structure of it, the particular angle of the jaw and the set of the cheekbones and the shape of the eyes, which were dark and watchful and possessed of the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who see more than they say, was a face that Joanne knew. Not because she had seen this painting before. She had not. She had never been in this corridor before in her life. She knew the face because she had seen it in every still surface she had passed for 23 years. In the well water, in the polished copper in the packed kitchen, in the dark window glass on winter mornings before the light came up. It was her face, not similar to her face, not reminiscent of her face. Her face, with 20 more years of certainty on it, standing in a garden she had never visited, wearing a dress in a color she had never owned, rendered in oil paint on a canvas that was clearly, undeniably, at minimum, a century old. "Who is this?" she asked. Cale turned back. He looked at the painting with the mild expression of someone for whom this image had become part of the scenery. "The sun-drenched Luna," he said. "Old portrait. Been here longer than anyone living can account for. The kings had scholars look at it twice. No one knows who she was or why she was painted. The plaque fell off the frame sometime before my father's time." Joanne looked at the empty rectangle at the bottom of the frame where a plaque had once been attached. The screws were still there. Whoever had removed it had not bothered to fill the holes. "Has anyone tried to find out?" Cale's expression shifted, not much, but enough. "People who asked too many questions about that painting tended to find other priorities," he said carefully. Then he seemed to decide he had said enough, and he turned back toward the vault door. "This way." She followed him, but she looked back at the painting once more before the corridor turned, and the woman in the gold dress looked back at her with dark, still eyes, and Joanne felt something move through her. Not fear, not quite, but the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous and not yet being able to see its shape. The Forbidden Vault was not, as its name might suggest, dramatically secured. The door was iron, yes, and heavy, and the lock was a triple mechanism that required 2 keys turned simultaneously, but the drama was in what lay beyond it. Not danger, not wards, not the prickling sense of old magic she had half expected, just paper. Paper everywhere, shelves from floor to ceiling on all 4 walls, packed with rolled documents and folded manuscripts in leather-bound ledgers of every thickness, interspersed with wooden cases of smaller items, seals, fragments of older vellum, once or twice a clay tablet with impression marks she recognized from her mother's notation book. At the center of the room, a long wooden table with a surface scarred by generations of use, a candle stand with 3 tapers, a stool. The smell was particular. Old ink, old leather, the specific cold of a room that has been sealed and unsealed many times over many years. Joanne stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed it in. Then she sat down and began. She had been given an instruction list by the king's secretary, a thin, precise man named Aldrich, who communicated primarily through written notes slid under doors. The instruction was to organize by date, to flag anything written in notation older than a century, and to create an index of any documents relating to lineage records, standard archival work, the kind of task that could take months if the documents were numerous, and these, she quickly established, were very numerous indeed. She started at the leftmost shelf and worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her to approach any problem too large to see all at once, in sections, taking only what could be handled, setting down what couldn't, returning to the difficult things only after the surrounding context had been built. She cataloged and sorted and flagged and noted, and the hours passed in the particular way that hours pass when the work is absorbing enough to make you forget to be cold. It was in the 3rd hour that she found the ledgers. They were not hidden exactly, they were simply shelved incorrectly, filed under domestic accounts rather than lineage records, which was either carelessness or calculation, and given what she was beginning to understand about this archive, she suspected the latter. They were a set of 12, bound in dark brown leather with no title on the spine, the covers worn smooth along the top edge from repeated handling. She pulled the first one and opened it on the table and leaned close to the candle. The writing was in a formal hand, dated to a period she estimated at roughly 200 years prior. The entries were structured like financial records, columns of dates, descriptions, and amounts, but the descriptions were not domestic. They were not household expenditures or trade records or the ordinary movement of money through an estate. The column heading at the top of each page read, in the formal notation of the period, "Obligations rendered." She turned the pages slowly. The amounts were substantial, not extraordinary by the standards of a crown treasury, but consistent and large and paid with a regularity that indicated not charity, but contract. Once per season, for as far back as the ledger ran. The recipient was listed in every entry as a variation of the same designation: the Rusk household, the family of Rusk, the Rusk line. Joanne's hands stilled on the page. She read the name again, moved to the next entry, read it again, moved back to the first ledger in the set and opened it to the earliest entry dated, and read, "Obligation rendered to the Rusk household per the terms of the standing agreement. First quarter payment, amount enclosed, not to be discussed." She sat back on the stool. Her name, her family's name, in financial records kept by the Alpha King's household, spanning, she counted the ledgers, counted the intervals, performed the arithmetic twice to be certain, 200 years. Her family had been receiving payments from the crown for 2 centuries, in amounts that suggested not charity, but contract. and neither the payer nor the recipient had apparently felt it necessary to explain this to her at any point during her 23 years of existence. She thought of Silas calling her mother peculiar and secretive. She thought of the journals with her father's name crossed out. She thought of the woman in the gold dress in the painting down the corridor, with Joanne's own eyes looking out from a face that was 100 years older than she was. She was still sitting there, very still, with the ledger open on the table and her hands flat on either side of it, when the vault door opened. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps exactly, but the particular quality of a silence that changes when someone enters it. She did not look up immediately. She finished reading the entry she was on, which she had already read 3 times, and then she looked up. Edward Garcia stood in the doorway of the vault in a coat that was slightly less formal than the one he had worn the previous evening, which on him still amounted to an architecture. He had a candle in one hand. He was looking at the open ledger on the table. Then he looked at her. She watched him register the fact that she was reading rather than sorting. She watched him decide, in the space of approximately 4 seconds, whether to address this. He came into the room and set his candle on the table and pulled up the second stool. She had not noticed there was a second stool until he produced it from beside the shelf, and sat down across from her with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided that a conversation is going to happen and intends to conduct it properly. "You found the obligation ledgers," he said. "Yes." "I wondered how long that would take." He looked at the open page. "How far back have you read?" "Far enough." She paused. 200 years of payments to a family called Rusk. A silence. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was not an evasive one either. He was considering something. She waited, because she had found over the years that waiting in silence was one of the most effective tools available to a person who wanted to understand what another person was actually thinking. "My father's archivist flagged those ledgers 8 years ago. He told my father they were domestic accounts from a peripheral estate, misfiled, and recommended they be destroyed as they were taking up space required for more recent records." "And your father?" "Had them destroyed. Or believed he had. I found those 12 in a subfloor case 3 months ago, which suggests that the archivist flagged them to my father and then did not actually follow the order." Joanne looked at the ledgers. "Why would he do that?" "I suspect," Edward said, "because he knew what they were and wanted them preserved even at risk to himself." He looked at her then, a direct look, the kind he noticed the previous evening, the kind that did not glance off the surface of a thing, but pressed into it. "You said your name is Joanne Rusk." "Yes." "From the Silver Moon Pack." "I was." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you that I hired you because of your notation skills, and that is true. But I also want to tell you that when you gave your name at the gate and the guard reported it to me, I made a decision to bring you inside rather than send you away, because your name appears in those ledgers, and I needed to understand why." He said it without apology or embellishment, the way he had spoken the previous evening, as though information had a shape, and that shape was best served by being stated plainly. She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very precise way of describing the fact that you thought I might be in the middle of whatever this is." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, not that far, but the thing that exists just before a smile, in a space where a person decides whether the moment warrants one. "You are," he said, "not like most people." "I have been told something similar," she said, "usually as an insult." It was not an insult. She looked back at the ledger. "The payments stop," she said. "The last entry is 23 years ago, the same year I was born." The vault was very quiet. "Yes," Edward said. "I noticed that as well." They worked together that evening and the next 3 after it, him clearing his schedule in a way that his secretary Aldrich communicated through increasingly strained written notes, her arriving at the vault each morning before he did and leaving only when the candles burned too low to read safely. She sorted, he cross-referenced. She flagged notation he couldn't read. He identified seals and crests and family marks she didn't recognize. It was the most orderly collaboration she had ever experienced, which was not difficult given that it was the only collaboration she had ever experienced, but she suspected it would have been notable under any circumstances. On the fourth evening, she found the contract. It was not in a ledger, it was not filed under any category she had yet established. It was inside a sealed wooden case she had almost overlooked because it had been placed at the very back of the bottom shelf, behind 2 boxes of blank vellum that were of no archival interest and had clearly been put there to occupy space in front of something that was not supposed to be found. The case was sealed with wax in a color she had not seen before in the archive. Not the standard red or black of official documents, but a deep, bruised blue that had darkened with age to something almost purple. The seal pressed into it was a crescent moon, bisected by a vertical line. She looked at it for a long time before she opened the case. The document inside was single, 1 page written in formal legal notation of the old period, with 2 signatures at the bottom and a third in the center of the page that had been crossed out in the same blue wax, pressed while still liquid so that it had run into the paper and stained it. The date at the top placed it at 190 years prior. She carried it to the table and set it under the best light and read. She read it once quickly to establish what it was. Then she read it slowly to make sure she had understood. Then she sat down on the stool and kept her hands flat on the table on either side of it and stared at the wall and breathed. She was still sitting like that when Edward came in. He saw her face before he saw the document. She knew this because he moved differently, faster, and without the usual deliberateness, crossing to the table in a way that suggested the document was going to need to be significant to warrant that expression on her face. He read it standing, which took longer than she expected, and she understood from the length of his reading that he was also reading it twice. When he looked up, his face had done the thing she had not yet seen it do. The careful structure of it had come slightly loose, not crumbled, just opened in the way that something opens when the pressure that was holding it closed is suddenly no longer sufficient. "A daughter of royal blood," he said. "Hidden in a servant line," she confirmed, "to prevent her from claiming the throne." She paused. "The contract is signed by your ancestor and by someone whose signature has been crossed out, in the same blue wax as the seal on the case." He looked at the crossed-out signature. The third party, the one who agreed to hide the child. She, or was compelled to. She looked at him. The wax over the signature, it's the same composition as the seal. Whoever crossed it out used the same instrument, which means either the signer crossed themselves out or someone with the same seal did it after. Why would the signer cross their own name? She thought of her mother. She thought of a journal with a name obscured by careful, deliberate ink. She thought of a woman who kept her daughter's mark covered for 23 years and said, "Keep this close, keep this close. One day you will need to know what it says." To protect someone, she said. To make sure that if the document was ever found, the person it named could not be traced through it. Edward was quiet. He looked at the date on the document. He looked at the crossed-out name. He looked at her. "The payments in the obligation ledgers," he said slowly. "They stopped 23 years ago, the same year you were born." "Yes." "Which means the family the payments were going to, the family the contract was designed to support and keep hidden, stopped receiving them at that point." "Yes." "Either because the agreement was considered complete," he paused, "or because the person the agreement was protecting was no longer alive to receive it." She thought of her mother dying when she was 12. She thought of the years before that, the careful, deliberate ordinariness of their life within the pack, the way her mother had always angled herself between Joanne and any real scrutiny. She thought of the mark on her shoulder, the crescent, the one she had been told was a birthmark, the one her mother covered every day of every winter and most days of every other season. She pulled aside the torn edge of her chemise, where the shoulder seam had begun to come away from the collar. She turned her left shoulder toward the candlelight. The mark was there, as it always was, the crescent bisected by a vertical line, faint against her skin, the color of old silver. The same shape as the seal on the document case, the same shape as the mark she had seen the evening before on the signet ring Edward wore on his right hand. He went very still. She watched him look from her shoulder to his ring and back to her shoulder again, and she watched the last careful structure of his composure do something it probably had not done in a very long time. It stopped being a performance and became something real. "That mark," he said. "My mother told me it was nothing. It is not nothing." "No," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that." The candles burned. Outside the vault, somewhere deep in the Citadel's old stone bones, something shifted. A sound too low to be sound, more like a vibration felt through the soles of the feet. As though the building itself was paying attention, as though it had been waiting for a very long time for these two people to sit across from each other in this particular room and arrive together at the edge of this particular truth. Joanna looked at the document. She looked at the crossed-out name at the center of the page, the ink over it thick enough to conceal, but not quite thick enough. She could see at the edges the curve of the first letter, an initial, the loop of something that might be a R. She did not say it aloud, not yet. The room was not ready for it yet, and neither, she suspected, was she. But she kept looking at it, long after Edward had sat down and the evening had settled into the particular silence of two people who had found themselves, unexpectedly, in the center of something much older and much larger than either of them had walked in expecting to find. He took the ring off slowly. Joanna had not asked him to. He had been looking at her shoulder, at the mark, the crescent bisected by its vertical line, and then he had looked at his own hand, and something had moved through his expression that she could not yet name, and then he had pulled the ring from his finger with the careful deliberateness of a man removing something he had worn so long he had stopped seeing it, and he set it on the table between them. It was heavier looking than she had expected, dark metal, not gold, with the crest pressed deep into the face, not painted or inlaid, but carved, so that the mark sat in the ring the way a word sits in a sentence, as though the object had been built around it rather than decorated with it afterward. The crescent, the line, the same proportions, the same angle, the same particular weight of design that she had carried on her left shoulder for 23 years without understanding what she was carrying. She did not touch it. She looked at it. "My father gave it to me when I took the crown," Edward said. "He told me it was the king's seal, that it had belonged to every alpha king in the Garcia line going back to the founding, that it was the mark of sovereign authority, and I was to wear it until I died and pass it to my heir." A pause. "He did not tell me what it meant. I asked him once. He said some symbols are older than their explanations, and that a king should not need to understand his own authority in order to exercise it." Joanna looked up from the ring. "That is a very elegant way of saying he didn't know either. Or a very elegant way of ensuring I would not look further." He leaned back slightly. "I have been looking further for 3 years. I have not found a single record in this citadel that explains where this mark came from or why my line carries it, until tonight." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother used to draw it." He looked at her. "In the dust," she said, "on the windowsill, on the floor near the hearth, sometimes in the condensation on the water barrel in winter. She never drew it when she thought I was watching, but I watched anyway, because I was a child, and she was the only interesting thing in my world, and I wanted to understand everything she did." She paused. "I asked her about it once. I was maybe 8 years old. I pointed to one she had drawn in the ash near the fire, and I asked her what it was. What did she say? She said it was a moon. I told her it didn't look like a moon. It looked like a moon with something through it. She said that was the point, that a moon with something through it meant a moon that had been stopped, a moon that should be moving and wasn't." Another pause. "I was 8. I thought she meant it was a drawing of a broken thing. I didn't ask again." Edward said nothing. He was watching her with the full, unguarded attention he had been slowly allowing himself over the past 4 days, the kind of attention that had begun as assessment and had become something else without either of them formally acknowledging the transition. She had noticed. She had chosen, so far, to not address it, because there were larger things to address, and she was a practical woman. A moon that had been stopped, he repeated. A power that had been bound, she said. That is what she meant. I understand that now. I think she was telling me, in the only way she felt safe to tell me, that something in me had been interrupted. She looked at the ring, and your family's mark is the seal of that interruption. The candles shifted, a draft from somewhere, though the vault door was closed. The flame on the nearest taper leaned towards her as though noting something. Edward picked up the ring and turned it between his fingers. My ancestors did not build this mark, he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. They inherited the obligation it represented, the guardian line. He looked at her. The contract says a daughter of royal blood was hidden in a servant line to prevent her from claiming the throne. It does not say who made that decision or why it was framed as protection, rather than suppression. Because suppression requires an enemy, protection only requires a reason. And a reason is easier to justify across 200 years. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment, then he put the ring back on. Not with the automatic motion of habit, but with the deliberate motion of a man making a decision about what a thing means, now that he knows what it is. Tomorrow, we find what else this vault is hiding. They did not get to tomorrow undisturbed. Joanne was in the vault the following afternoon, alone. Edward had been pulled into a crown obligation, some council matter his secretary had communicated with the pained urgency of a man managing a schedule that was rapidly becoming ungovernable, when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Not Cale's step, which she had come to recognize by its rhythm and weight, not Edward's, which was slower and more deliberate. These were faster, more than one person, and they did not have the quality of people who were uncertain about their destination. She had enough time to close the document case and push it toward the back of the table before the vault door opened. The man who entered first was thin in the way that very controlled people are thin, not from want but from discipline. Every excess burned away until what remained was only function. He had the kind of face that suggested he had long ago decided which expressions were worth the expenditure and had reduced his repertoire accordingly. Thin lips, eyes that moved across the room with the speed and flatness of something calculating rather than seeing. He wore the traveling coat of a council alpha, the silver trim on the collar indicating rank, and he wore it the way powerful men wear formal clothing, as a reminder rather than an adornment. Behind him came two others, larger, quieter, the kind of men whose purpose is to stand slightly behind other men and make the silence more significant. "You must be the archivist," the thin man said. He did not phrase it as a question. "I am," Joanne said. "Vane," he said, "Shadow Council. I have been sent to conduct an inspection of the ancestral archive." He looked around the vault with the expression of someone inventorying a problem. His gaze moved over the shelves, the organized documents, the indexed ledgers she had spent 4 days sorting, and then it stopped, briefly and with great precision, on the document case she had pushed to the back of the table. "The king was informed of this inspection last week." "The king did not mention it to me," she said. "The king's archivist does not require a separate notification." He moved into the room. She did not step back, though the instinct was there, the old instinct, the one trained by years of making herself smaller to avoid attention. She held her ground and watched him. "The directive from the council," Vane continued, picking up one of the indexed ledgers from the sorted pile and turning it over in his hands with the casual authority of someone accustomed to handling other people's work, "is to assess which materials in this archive are of historical relevance and which are unnecessary." "All historical records are by definition historically relevant," she said. Vane looked at her. The look was the particular look of a man who is unaccustomed to being answered by someone he has already categorized as beneath answering. Records that contain inaccuracies or that reflect outdated and superseded structures of governance are not historical records, they are liabilities. The council has the authority to order the destruction of any archival material deemed inconvenient. The word landed in the room with a precision she had intended. Vane was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Destabilizing," he said. His eyes moved to the document case again. "The archive is under the king's authority," she said, "not the council's." "The king," Vane said, his voice dropping into something that was almost gentle, which was worse than if it had been harsh, "is a young man who has been spending considerable time in a basement with old paper and a servant girl. The council has concerns about the nature of his current priorities." The vault door opened. Edward walked in with the particular quality of someone who has been outside a room long enough to understand what is happening inside it. He was still in the more formal coat. The council meeting had not apparently concluded as pleasantly as Vane's arrival implied it should have. He looked at Vane, then at the 2 men behind him, then at Joanne, a look that lasted only a second but covered the relevant ground, then back at Vane. "Counselor," he said. "Your Majesty." Vane inclined his head in the specific degree that communicated respect without warmth. "I was explaining the council's directive to your archivist." "I heard," Edward said. He came fully into the room and stood at the table. He did not sit. "The archive is not subject to council inspection without my prior authorization, which I have not given. The council's charter allows—" "I know what the charter allows," Edward said. His voice had not raised. It had done the opposite, in fact. It had quieted in the way that very certain things quiet when they have stopped needing to perform certainty. "You will be reporting this to the full council." "Do," Edward said, "and tell them I will be sending a formal response to the charter question within the week. In the meantime, the vault will remain sealed to non-authorized personnel. Good evening, Counselor." Vane held his position for 3 seconds. Then he turned and left, his 2 silent companions behind him, and the vault door closed, and the room was quiet again. Joanne let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. "He knew about the document case," she said. "Yes," Edward said, "which means he has been inside this vault before, or someone who reports to him has." He looked at the case on the table, then at her. "We need to find what else is here before he finds a way back in." She found it the following morning in the last place she had not yet searched, a flat wooden drawer built into the underside of the archive table, so flush with the surface that she had used the table for 4 days without noticing it existed. She found it because she dropped her notation pencil and crouched to retrieve it, and the angle of the candlelight from below caught the seam. The drawer had no lock. It had, instead, the kind of concealment that relies on not being noticed rather than not being opened. The understanding that a thing obvious enough to see once found is invisible until the finding. Inside it, wrapped in treated cloth that had kept the moisture out for what the condition of the material suggested was a very long time, was a single document. Not paper, not vellum. The material was something she had no name for, translucent, faintly luminous in the candlelight, with the quality of something that had been made rather than grown, constructed for preservation rather than mere writing. Her mother's notation book called such materials by a name she had only seen twice in the text, crystal vellum, reserved, the book said, for records of singular importance, records that were meant to last beyond the institutions that created them. She carried it to the light with both hands and unfolded it. It was a birth record. The format was formal, ancient, the notation style the oldest she had encountered in the entire archive. At the top, the crescent and line seal, pressed in the same blue wax she had now seen twice. Below it, the standard fields of a lineage document, bloodline, parentage, date of emergence, and name. The bloodline field read, lunar primordial, first origin, unbroken. The parentage field named a mother. The name in the parentage field was the name from her mother's journal, not crossed out here, fully written in the clean, formal hand of a record keeper who had not yet understood that this document would need to be hidden. Below it, the father's name, which she did not recognize, and below that, in the name field, in the same hand, 2 words, Joanne. Luna. She sat down. Or perhaps she was already sitting. She was not entirely sure later of the precise order of events in the next few minutes, because the thing that happened to her when she read those two words was not an intellectual event. It was something older than thought, something that moved through her the way the first real cold of winter moves, not as a sensation arriving from outside, but as a recognition of something that was always present and had simply, until this moment, been given permission to be felt. Her name was not a name. It had never been a name. It was a title. It was the thing they had been trying to hide, written in plain sight, given to her by a mother who had crossed out every other identifying detail in every other record and then looked at her newborn daughter and written her hidden crown directly onto her birth certificate in the most formal notation available on a material designed to outlast everything. Her mother had known. Her mother had known all of it and had given her this, not a mystery to solve, but a key held in the only place no one would think to look. Her own name, spoken aloud every day for 23 years by people who thought it meant nothing. Joanne. Luna. She was still holding the document when Edward came in. She did not say anything. She turned the crystal vellum toward him and watched him read it. She watched his face as he reached the name field. She watched him look up at her. "Your mother named you your own title," Edward said. She couldn't hide the document. She couldn't destroy it. Crystal vellum can't be burned. I read that in her notation book. So she hid it where no one would find it, and she gave me the one piece of it she could keep safe forever, because no one can take a name once it's been spoken enough times. Edward set the document on the table very carefully. He looked at it, then at her. The suppression agreement names a daughter of royal blood hidden to prevent her from claiming the throne. This document names that daughter, and the mark on your shoulder is the seal of her bloodline. He paused. "Joanne." "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "I need to say it plainly. You are the lost Luna. The first origin line runs through you." "I know. I have known in some way I couldn't name for longer than I can account for. I just didn't have the language for it." She looked at the crystal vellum. "The question is what it means now." She did not finish the sentence. She did not finish it because the mark on her shoulder had begun to burn. Not painfully. Not the way burns announce themselves with heat and damage and the body's alarm. This was different. A heat that moved inward rather than outward, that radiated from the crescent mark toward her spine and then up through her chest and down through her hands and into her fingertips. And with it came a sound she was hearing not with her ears, but with some part of her that had no name in ordinary language. Low, ancient, the sound of something sealed for a very long time beginning, at last, to move. Vane came back that evening. He did not come with 2 men, he came with 7, and with a document bearing the council's full seal, and with the particular expression of a man who has spent 24 hours constructing an authority he believes is now sufficient. He also came with fire. Not literally, but the order he carried was for the immediate cessation of archival work and the controlled disposal of materials deemed sensitive. And the word controlled was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Edward met him in the vault corridor. Joanne was inside, but the door was open, and she could hear everything. And she held the crystal vellum document against her chest with both hands and listened. "The council has voted," Vane said. "Majority ruling. The archive is to be sealed and all materials flagged during the current project or to be reviewed by a council-appointed committee before any findings are reported to—" "No," Edward said. A pause. "Your Majesty?" "No," Edward said again, the same quietness as before. Quieter, perhaps. "I know what you're protecting, Vane. I know what the Council has been protecting for 200 years. I have the suppression agreement, I have the obligation ledgers, and I have something that renders your committee, your vote, and your order entirely without standing." "The girl is a servant," Vane said, his voice losing its thinness and finding something that was almost desperation beneath it. "Whatever she has told you, whatever she has shown you, she has been manipulating." "She has been reading," Edward said. "That is all she has done. She read what was there. The documents did not become what they are because she found them. They were always what they are." She walked out of the vault. She did not plan it, or she did in the way that the body sometimes makes decisions the mind endorses only afterward. She walked out into the corridor with the crystal vellum held in one hand and her back straight and her chin level, the way she had walked out of Silver Moon territory in the mud with everything she owned in her broken trunk. And she stood beside Edward, and she looked at Vane. Vane looked at the document in her hand. His face changed. The calculation in it gave way, briefly and terribly, to something genuine: recognition and fear. "That document does not prove—" "It names me," she said, "my full name, on the formal notation of the first origin lineage record, on crystal vellum, which cannot be destroyed, which has been legally binding under pact law since before your council existed." "You cannot shift," Vane said, and it came out with the force of something he had been holding ready. "A Luna who cannot shift is no Luna at all. You are a human woman with a birthmark and a convenient document, and the council will—" The mark on her shoulder tore through the fabric of her camise. Not the cloth tearing, the light. The crescent and line seal, which had been faintly silver her entire life, opened into white-blue luminescence that had no interest in being contained by worn earth-toned fabric. And it moved. Not just on her skin, but through the air around her, tracing the seal's shape in the space between her body and the corridor wall, growing, filling, and with it came the sound again, the ancient low register that had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with recognition. She felt the suppression break. It was not dramatic. That was the thing she would remember later, when she tried to find language for it. It was not the violent, explosive release she might have expected from something sealed for 200 years. It was more like a knot, held so long it had forgotten it was a knot, suddenly and completely released. Like a breath drawn at last after a long involuntary stillness. Like a word finally said aloud after years of being kept in the throat. Something vast and white and ancient rose through her, and she let it come. The wolf that emerged in the corridor of the Forbidden Vault was not like the wolves of the Silver Moon Pack. It was not like any wolf any of the people in that corridor had seen in their living memory. And several of them, the 7 men Vane had brought, experienced alphas by rank and by blood, took steps backward without deciding to. It was white, entirely white. White the way the moon is white, not by color, but by quality, as though the whiteness was not a surface, but a source. It was large in the way that things are large when the measure being used is not physical. And it looked at Vane with dark, still eyes that had the particular quality of something that has been patient for 2 centuries and is now at last done with patience. Vane ran. The others, after approximately 3 seconds of individual deliberation, made the same decision. The wolf stood in the corridor until the sound of footsteps had entirely faded. Then the light settled, gently, back into something quieter, and Joanne was herself again, standing in the corridor in what remained of her camise, with the crystal vellum document still in her right hand, which she found, in retrospect, somewhat remarkable. She turned. Edward was on one knee. He was not performing it. That was what struck her. There was none of the ceremony of a formal kneeling, no particular placement of the hands or set of the shoulders that indicated a man fulfilling a protocol. He was simply down, one knee on the stone floor of the vault corridor, looking up at her with his face entirely open, and his ring hand resting on his raised knee, the crescent seal catching the torchlight. "Not as a king," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Get up," she said, not unkindly. "We have a great deal of work to do, and I would like at some point to eat something. I have not eaten since this morning." Something broke across his face then, the thing that had been waiting just before a smile for 4 days, and he stood, and it was not, in the end, so very far between them. The Dowager Queen Isabella had been hosting banquets at the Citadel for 40 years. She had hosted them for wars and treaties and births and deaths and alliances that everyone in the room understood to be threats dressed in formal clothing. She had sat at the head of tables that held some of the most dangerous people on the continent and had never once allowed the occasion to become something other than what she intended it to be. She was silver-haired and impeccable, and possessed of the specific social precision of a woman who had learned long ago that the most effective power is the kind that looks to everyone watching like simple elegance. When her son had told her what the archive had contained and what it meant and who Joanne Rusk was, she had listened with her hands folded on the table and her expression entirely composed, and when he had finished, she had said, "Then we host a dinner," and had given him no further opportunity to discuss it before beginning to plan. The invitations went out within the week. The Shadow Council received theirs last, which was a deliberate timing that Isabella had engineered with the kind of pleasantry that left no room for refusal. Joanne learned what the gown looked like only when it arrived. She had expected something suitable, something appropriate. She had not expected deep gold, the specific, saturated, ancient gold of the portrait at the end of the corridor. The gold of the woman in the painting whose face was her face, whose eyes were her eyes, who had stood in an oil-painted garden 200 years before Joanne was born and looked out from the canvas with the certainty of someone who knew exactly who she was. She stood in the small room in the east corridor, her room still, because she had not yet moved into the Luna's chamber which Isabella had already had prepared and which Joanne had not yet been able to approach without a complicated feeling she was still sorting out. She held the gown against her chest and looked at her own reflection in the dark window glass. She thought of her mother. She thought of, "Keep this close, one day you will need to know what it says." She thought of a small woman drawing a crescent in the dust by the hearth and calling it a stopped moon and meaning something else entirely. "I know now," she thought. "I know what it said." She dressed carefully. The banquet hall was full when she entered. Isabella had arranged the seating with the precision of someone composing a sentence in which every word carries weight. The Shadow Council occupied the far side of the table. Alpha Silas of the Silver Moon Pack. She had not known he would be here until she saw him, large and scarred and slightly less certain-looking than he had been in the pack circle, sat 2 seats from Vane, who had come because refusing had not been an available option. The other alphas, the ones who had watched from their packs and their comfortable distances as she had been categorized and dismissed and exiled, were placed with the careful deliberateness of people who have been seated precisely so they cannot miss what is about to happen. The hall went quiet when she walked in. Not immediately, the way sound reduces in a room when something enters that shifts the room's understanding of itself. She heard it happen, the conversations tapering one by one from the far end of the table forward, like a wave moving in reverse, until she reached her chair and the hall was entirely still. She sat down. She placed the crystal vellum document on the table in front of her, which Isabella had suggested and which Joanne had agreed was appropriate. The document caught the candlelight and held it in the way that crystal vellum holds light, not reflecting it, but keeping it, luminous from within. Silas was looking at her. She could feel it the way you feel weather, not see it, but know it with the whole surface of yourself. She looked back at him. She held his gaze with the stillness she had spent 23 years perfecting in his pack's kitchen, and she watched him be the one to look away first. Isabella rose from her end of the table. "You are gathered," she said, with the voice of a woman who has never once doubted whether a room would listen to her, "because this house has a truth to present. Not a version of events, not a reframing of history, a truth, documented and witnessed and older than any authority currently seated at this table." She looked at the council, at Vane, at Silas. Her gaze moved across the room with the quality of something very sharp moved very slowly. The lost Luna of the first origin has been found. Her bloodline is unbroken. Her documents are incontestable. And this house, she placed one hand flat on the table, will not be pretending otherwise. Vane opened his mouth. "Counselor Vane," Isabella said pleasantly, "I would encourage you very warmly to consider the document on the table before you decide what you would like to say next." He closed his mouth. Edward, seated beside Joanne, did not speak. He looked at her once, a look that was brief and complete, the look of a man who has said what needed to be said in a corridor on one knee and does not need to repeat himself in a formal setting. She met it and looked back at the room. She was not performing composure. That was the difference between tonight and every other night of her life. She was not assembling herself carefully to prevent anyone from seeing what was underneath. What was underneath was visible, and it was this: a woman who walked 3 days through winter and sorted documents by candlelight and stood in a corridor while her bloodline's power broke a 200-year seal, and who was still here, still sitting upright, still entirely herself. One by one, the alphas along the far side of the table inclined their heads, not as a performance, as a reckoning. Silas was last. She watched him work through it, the arithmetic of power, the recalculation of every assumption he had made in the gathering circle when he had thrown her trunk into the mud and declared her nothing. She watched him arrive, finally and without grace, at the far shore of that recalculation. He inclined his head. She did not give him warmth. She did not give him coldness either. She gave him the same measured regard she had given the documents in the archive, clear-eyed, thorough, without malice and without performance. The regard of someone who knows precisely what she is looking at and has already decided what it means. She picked up her glass. Isabella gave the signal that the meal could begin, and the hall filled again with sound, carefully first, and then more genuinely, the way sound fills a room that has been cleared of something heavy and is learning slowly how to breathe again. Under the table, Edward's hand found hers, not formally, just his hand finding hers, the way things find each other when the distance between them has finally been acknowledged. She did not look at him. She looked out at the room, at the gold candlelight on old stone, at the faces rearranging themselves around a new truth, at the document glowing quietly on the table in front of her, with her name written on it in the oldest notation she knew. Joanne, Luna. She had been called nothing for 23 years by people who were afraid of what she actually was. She had walked out of their mud with her back straight and her chin level, and she had not looked behind her, and she had been right not to, because everything worth arriving at had been ahead of her all along. She was here now. She was exactly where she had always been meant to be.